Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive.
Yes.
Today, we're going way back in time to explore something
Okay.
that I think is really fascinating.
Okay.
The Old Testament sanctuary,
Yes.
as described in Exodus chapters 25 and 26.
Right.
And we're going to try to uncover the symbolism
Okay.
behind its design.
Sounds good.
It's almost like we're decoding a blueprint
Uh-huh.
where every single detail points to something much deeper.
It is amazing what we can learn from the ancient Israelites' beliefs
Right.
and values just by looking at how they structured this space.
Yeah, it's not just a history lesson, though.
No?
I think this dive into the sanctuary could give us ideas for how we create meaningful spaces
Oh, absolutely.
in our lives.
Yeah. The sanctuary was so much more than just a place of worship.
Okay.
It had a threefold purpose.
All right.
Okay, so first it was meant to be God's dwelling place on earth,
Okay.
then a center for Israel's spiritual well-being
Okay.
and the heart of their religious life.
Wow. So it's almost like they saw God present
Yeah.
in every single aspect of their existence.
Exactly. It wasn't just about going to a special building once a week.
Yeah.
Their entire worldview was built around the idea of living in God's presence.
Wow.
Even the language they used reflects this.
Okay.
There are 5
Okay.
different Hebrew terms
Uh-huh.
for this sacred space,
Wow.
each with its own shade of meaning.
So how did they even go about building this sanctuary?
Where?
It sounds pretty elaborate for a group of people
Yeah.
wandering through the desert.
Well, the materials themselves were actually a key part of the story.
Okay.
Everything used to build the sanctuary was given as a free will offering
Wow.
for the people.
Okay.
Gold, silver, precious stones, even acacia wood.
Acacia wood.
Yeah.
Why that specific type?
It's interesting.
Okay.
Some scholars believe that acacia wood might be linked back to the Garden of Eden.
Wow. So even the building materials connect back to that idea of paradise
Exactly.
and God dwelling with humanity.
It's like they were bringing the best of creation back to its creator.
Wow.
And think about the dyes for the textiles,
Okay.
like blue and purple.
Yeah.
These colors came from sea snails
Oh, wow.
and required a really labor-intensive process,
Okay.
which made them incredibly valuable.
So it seems like every element was carefully chosen to symbolize something deeper.
Absolutely. And that intentionality becomes even more evident when we look at the furniture.
The furniture.
Yeah, within the sanctuary,
Okay.
there were 7 main pieces,
Evan.
each with a unique function.
Okay.
The Ark of the Covenant,
Mm-hmm.
the mercy seat, the table of the bread of the presence, the golden menorah,
Wow.
the golden altar of incense, the bronze altar for burnt offerings, and the bronze basin.
7 pieces.
Yeah,
That's a lot to unpack.
it is.
And I'm guessing their placement wasn't random either.
You're right. The layout was very intentional.
Okay.
The sanctuary was divided into 3 main spaces: the outer courtyard, the holy place,
Okay.
and the most sacred space of all,
Oh.
the Holy of Holies.
So it's almost like a journey inward,
Yeah,
moving from the everyday world into closer and closer proximity
I got it.
to God's presence.
And this journey is mirrored in the way they approached Mount Sinai,
Oh, okay.
with different levels of holiness as you ascended the mountain.
Let's start with the Ark of the Covenant, because that one always seems to capture people's imaginations.
Right.
What made it so special?
Well, the Ark is incredibly significant for a few reasons.
Okay.
First, it was the designated container for the 10 Commandments,
Okay.
God's covenant with Israel.
Mm-hmm.
So it represented this binding agreement
Yeah.
between God and his people.
So it's like their most important document
Right.
kept safe and secure in this sacred chest.
Exactly. But the Ark's importance goes beyond just storing the tablets.
Okay.
It was also considered the meeting point between heaven and earth,
Wow.
the place where God's presence manifested most powerfully.
That makes sense why it was placed in the Holy of Holies.
Right.
The most restricted area of the sanctuary.
Only the high priest could enter that space.
Okay.
And even then, only once a year,
Once a year.
on Yom Kippur,
Uh,
which is the Day of Atonement.
wait, so Yom Kippur and the Day of Atonement are the same thing?
Yes. Yom Kippur is the Hebrew name
Okay.
for the Day of Atonement,
Got it.
the most solemn day in the Jewish calendar.
Okay.
It was a day of fasting and repentance,
Mm-hmm.
focused on seeking forgiveness and reconciliation with God.
So back to the Ark.
Okay?
I've always been curious about those cherubim figures on top.
Yeah.
The 10 Commandments forbid making images, so how did those fit in?
It's a great question,
Yeah.
and one that has sparked a lot of discussion.
Okay.
The key is understanding that the prohibition against images
Mm-hmm.
was about preventing idolatry,
Okay.
the worship of false gods, represented by those images.
So these cherubim weren't meant to be worshipped themselves?
Exactly. They were more like symbolic representations of God's presence.
Okay.
His power and holiness guarding the ark and the sacred space within.
That's a helpful distinction.
Yeah.
And it really highlights how much thought and intention went into every detail of the sanctuary's design. It wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about communicating deeper truths.
Precisely. And speaking of details, even the materials used to construct the ark are significant.
Okay.
It was made of acacia wood overlaid with gold.
Acacia wood possibly linked to the Garden of Eden.
Right.
And gold symbolizing purity and divinity, it all ties together.
Exactly. It's like they were recreating a piece of paradise.
Yeah.
A place where God's presence could dwell among them.
Speaking of God's presence, you mentioned the mercy seat.
Yes.
Where does that fit into all of this?
Well, imagine this.
Okay.
A solid gold lid placed on top of the ark
Okay.
with 2 more golden cherubim fashioned with their wings outstretched,
Wow.
as if hovering protectively over it.
Like they were guarding something incredibly precious.
And they were.
Okay.
The space between those cherubim on the mercy seat was considered the most sacred spot in the entire sanctuary.
Wow.
It was believed to be where God's presence manifested most directly.
So the mercy seat wasn't just a decorative element.
Not at all. It played a crucial role in that Yom Kippur ritual we were talking about,
Right.
the Day of Atonement.
Mm-hmm.
Once a year, the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies,
Okay.
sprinkle the blood of a sacrificed animal on the mercy seat,
Wow.
and plead for God's forgiveness on behalf of the whole nation.
It sounds like a powerful and dramatic ceremony.
It is.
Emphasizing just how seriously they took the idea of seeking atonement
Yes.
and reconciliation with God.
It also highlights the role of the high priest as a mediator
Okay.
between God and the people.
Mm-hmm.
He was the only one allowed to enter that sacred space
Okay.
and perform those vital rituals.
It's incredible how all these pieces, the art, the mercy seat,
Yeah.
even the cherubim figures work together to tell a story about their relationship with God.
Mm-hmm.
But I know there's more to explore within the holy place. We have the table of the bread of the presence
Right.
and the golden menorah, right?
You're right, and both of these are just as fascinating as the ark.
Okay.
They tell us a lot about the ancient Israelites' understanding of God's provision and guidance.
This is where it gets really interesting. So let's dive into those next.
Okay.
Okay. I'm really curious about these other furnishings in the holy place.
Yeah.
What was the table of the bread of the presence all about?
Well, picture this.
Okay.
A table made of acacia wood overlaid with gold,
Mm-hmm.
holding 12 loaves of unleavened bread,
Okay.
arranged in 2 rows.
12 loaves.
Yeah.
That's significant, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Uh,
These loaves, known as the bread of the presence,
Okay.
represented the 12 tribes of Israel.
Wow.
Every week, the priest would replace them with fresh bread,
Okay.
symbolizing this constant offering of sustenance to God.
So it's more than just providing physical food, isn't it?
Exactly. It's
Right.
about recognizing God as the ultimate provider.
Right.
It's a symbolic act of gratitude and dependence.
Okay.
Imagine the Israelites
Yeah.
wandering through the desert,
Right.
dependent on God for everything.
Yeah.
This ritual would have been a powerful reminder of that reliance.
It really paints a vivid picture of their relationship with God.
Mm.
Now, across from this table, we have the golden menorah.
Yes.
I can almost picture it illuminating the holy place with its 7 branches.
The menorah wasn't just a fancy lampstand.
Yeah.
It was a symbol of God's presence, his light guiding and protecting his people.
Okay.
And the number 7,
Mm-hmm.
often associated with completion and perfection in the Bible,
Mm-hmm.
might represent the fullness of God's light and wisdom.
Keeping that menorah burning continuously would have been a pretty powerful
Oh, yeah.
visual reminder of God's constant presence, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. Imagine the Israelites camped out under the desert sky at night,
Wow.
looking towards the tabernacle and seeing that light shining.
Yeah.
It must have been a source of comfort and reassurance,
Yeah.
knowing that God was with them even in the darkness.
You know, it makes me think about how we create those kinds of reminders in our own lives today.
Yes.
Maybe it's a special place in our homes for prayer or meditation,
Mm-hmm.
or even just a favorite passage of scripture that we turn to for comfort and guidance.
I love that connection.
Yeah.
The sanctuary really can be a source of inspiration for how we cultivate a sense of the sacred in our own lives.
Right.
But let's not forget about those other furnishings we mentioned earlier.
Okay.
The golden altar of incense, the bronze altar of burnt offerings,
Right.
and the bronze basin.
Right, we haven't talked about those yet.
Yeah.
And I'm especially curious about the altars.
Okay.
Because they seem to represent a different aspect of their relationship with God.
You're right. These objects shift the focus to the idea of sacrifice and atonement. The
Yeah.
bronze altar,
Mm-hmm.
located in the outer courtyard,
Okay.
was the place where animals were sacrificed.
Okay.
This act of offering a sacrifice was a way of seeking forgiveness for sins
Okay.
and restoring a right relationship with God.
It sounds intense. What about the golden altar of incense?
Yeah.
Where was that located?
That one was inside the holy place,
Okay.
right in front of the veil that separated it from the Holy of Holies.
Okay.
The priest would burn incense on this altar,
Okay.
and the fragrant smoke was seen as a symbol of prayers rising up to God.
It's interesting how even the senses smell in this case
Right.
were incorporated into their worship.
Uh-huh.
And what about that bronze basin? What was its purpose?
The bronze basin was also located in the outer courtyard,
Okay.
and it was used for ritual washing.
Okay.
Before the priests could enter the tabernacle to perform their duties, they
Okay.
had to wash their hands and feet in this basin.
So it was about purification,
Exactly.
preparing themselves to enter the sacred space.
It symbolized the need for inner cleansing and purity before approaching God.
Right.
And this theme of purification and atonement really ties back to what we were talking about earlier,
Yeah.
with the Day of Atonement and the high priest's role.
Right. It's all starting to connect, but I'm still trying to wrap my head around this idea of animal sacrifice.
Yeah.
It seems so foreign to us today.
It can be a difficult concept to grasp from our modern perspective.
Yeah.
But for the Israelites, it was a central part of their religious practice.
Okay.
They believed that the blood of the sacrifice atoned for their sins,
Mm-hmm.
making it possible for them to be reconciled to God.
It makes you wonder about the evolution of religious thought and practice, doesn't it?
It does.
How these ancient rituals paved the way for new understandings of sacrifice and atonement.
It's a fascinating journey to trace.
Yeah.
And speaking of journeys,
Okay.
we can't forget that the tabernacle itself was a portable structure
Right.
designed to be assembled and disassembled as the Israelites wandered through the desert.
Oh, right. I almost forgot about that whole nomadic lifestyle thing.
Right.
It's mind-boggling to think about them packing and unpacking all those elaborate furnishings every time they moved camp.
Can you imagine? But it really underscores how important the tabernacle was to them.
Right.
It wasn't just a building. It was the center of their community,
Okay.
a tangible representation of their relationship with God.
Mhm.
They carried it with them wherever they went.
It almost makes you think about how we carry our own sacred spaces with us today.
Yes.
Maybe it's a treasured object, a photograph, or even just a memory
Right.
that brings us comfort and connects us to something larger than ourselves.
It's beautiful to think about how these ancient concepts can still resonate with us
Yeah.
in such personal and meaningful ways.
Right.
And speaking of connections,
Okay.
we've talked about the layout of the sanctuary and its division into 3 spaces.
Mm-hmm.
But what about the overall structure itself?
Yeah.
What did it look like from the outside?
So we've talked about the layout inside with those different layers of holiness, but what about the tabernacle's outward appearance?
Well,
What would someone walking by have seen?
picture a tent-like structure covered in layers of woven fabrics and animal skins.
Okay. Not exactly glamorous from the outside?
No, not really.
Okay.
But those layers served a purpose.
Okay.
They protected the sacred space within from the elements.
Makes sense.
So they used finely woven linen,
Okay.
goat's hair, ram's skins, and a final layer of fine leather.
It sounds more like a sturdy, well-engineered shelter than just a simple tent.
Right. That's the thing about the tabernacle.
Yeah.
It was a fascinating blend of practicality and symbolism.
Right.
Everything had a purpose,
Okay.
both functional and spiritual.
We talked earlier about how the sanctuary was oriented facing east towards the rising sun.
Yeah.
Why was that significant?
Well, remember our deep dive into Genesis?
Yes.
East and west held symbolic meaning,
Right.
and entering from the east and moving westward towards the Holy of Holies
Okay.
was like a journey towards God's presence.
It's incredible how these ideas from Genesis are echoed in the design of the sanctuary.
It is.
It shows how deeply intertwined their worldview and their sacred spaces were.
Right, and it's not just the Old Testament.
Wow.
Early Christian churches adopted this east-west orientation as well.
Wow, that's...
It's amazing how these ancient concepts influenced religious architecture for centuries.
really makes you appreciate the lasting power of these symbols
Absolutely.
and how they continue to resonate across time and cultures.
And speaking of lasting power, We've covered so much ground in this deep dive.
Yes, we have.
The layout, the furnishings, the symbolism,
Right.
it all boils down to this.
Okay.
The sanctuary was a tangible expression of the Israelites' desire to connect with God.
It was like they were creating a space where heaven and earth could meet.
Exactly.
Wow.
And even though the tabernacle itself is long gone,
Yeah.
the principles it embodied are timeless.
Okay.
The importance of creating sacred spaces,
Yeah.
whether physical or metaphorical,
Right.
the understanding that there are different levels of spiritual understanding, and the enduring power of symbolism to convey profound truths.
Right.
These are all ideas that still speak to us today.
They do. And as we wrap up this deep dive, what's one final thought-provoking question you would leave our listener with?
Well, knowing that the sanctuary prefigured the new covenant established by Jesus,
Okay.
how do the elements and rituals we've discussed find their fulfillment in the Christian faith?
Wow.
And how can we find, inspired by the Israelites' example, create those sacred spaces in our own lives, fostering that same sense of reverence and connection with the divine?
That's a great question for all of us to think about.
Yes.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Old Testament sanctuary.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure.